Considering WarioWare's particular strengths, it's not surprising it's managed to attract a number of impersonators over the years. Its fast-paced, constantly shifting, and ridiculously simple gameplay is ripe for both imitation and iteration, although I would hope that any copycat uses its building blocks in a unique way. At the very least, we can wish that those games inspired by it are similarly bombastic, right? The latest Mimic is Mindwave, with a demo and Kickstarter coming out recently. Suffice to say, Mindwave is very similar to Wario in a great many ways. That alone is probably enough to get some fans of that game to try it out. Others, like myself, would like new takes on the formula to iterate on the idea at least a little. Otherwise, it fails to make itself meaningfully distinct. Rather than lay out all the things it does the same as its predecessor, let's save time and skip to talking about what makes it different. What immediately stands out when you begin playing is that Mindwave has a significant focus on story, unlike Wario. I expect that most prospective players can be split up into groups of either finding the story to potentially be a very important part of the whole, or wondering why a system structured like Wario of all games needs a narrative at the forefront in the first place. Either way, I'm going to disregard this element of the game in my analysis. Writing critique isn't really the focus of my channel, and I don't want to talk about the writing based on the mere 30 minutes available. What would be thoughtless of me to ignore, however, are the consequences that this shift in focus has on the gameplay and the overall product. Bringing the microgames into the context of a story allows the game to iterate on the Wario formula in a unique way. By framing the act of playing as a mental battle between yourself and an opponent, rather than a mostly detached and unrelated set of games, Mindwave presents a chance for the player to become more immersed and personally invested in the gameplay. To be fair, a portion of Wario fans probably don't care one bit whether they have any amount of personal stake in the microgames, so this opportunity will go unused for some. But I don't think that's cause for thinking that the change is inherently bad. It's also worth defending against accusations that this style might affect replayability. One of the biggest draws of the WarioWare series is its enormous replay value. While the story sequences present in Mindwave may potentially deter the player from replaying the campaign in the final product, I also think that worrying the story will impede the progress of the game for those uninterested is unfounded. Both the cutscenes and the visual novel sequence in the demo can be skipped, which I would imagine is going to be the standard for the entire game. Either way, the remix modes are the real meat and potatoes of Wario's replay value, which is the same for Mindwave. The story doesn't impact these at all, so they remain unaffected. Another outcome of spotlighting the story is that it shifts the center of gameplay away from the microgames themselves. In Wario, the meager story that does exist is simply there to provide a bit of flavor. It supports the microgames by providing an aesthetic framework they often take advantage of. Because Mindwave is so concentrated on its narrative, you could almost say that the reverse is true, to an extent. The microgames fill a role in the fiction, giving a mechanical foundation that supports the idea of a story about arranged psychic combat. While the gameplay is still very important, it's tied into the story in a way that makes it hard to ignore the narrative if you want to get the most out of this game. On its face, this could be said to be a disservice to the mechanics it's appropriated, but I think that would be to ignore what's being done here overall. Considering it deviates greatly from the source of its mechanics, you would hope that whatever changes have been made act to differentiate it meaningfully from its inspiration. Rather than merely using Wario's gameplay in a samey way, it forces an apples to oranges comparison by reframing the microgames in a new context, allowing it to present a fresh experience instead of one solely derivative. I'd say that this is the element that does the most to validate Mindwave's approach to story. Rehashing the old systems with no substantive changes would have been the safe, simple, and bland move. And regardless of how you feel about the less centralized core gameplay, I hope we can all agree that a new take on things can work to justify this title as a whole. With plenty of WarioWare games already in existence, more of the same would satisfy no one but the most die-hard fans. If you want the core Wario experience, the original series is right there. Of course, it's also not too much to expect the microgames to have quality in and of themselves. While more similar than not to what it's emulating, there's still some relevant differences. A technological advantage Mindwave has over its biggest inspiration is that it's PC software, which allows it to make use of a mouse and keyboard. One would hope that any Wario act-alike utilizes its control scheme in a clever manner, and Mindwave does to a very commendable degree. While a keyboard's keys are functionally similar to a controller's buttons in many ways, Mindwave occasionally takes advantage of a keyboard's volume of switches to a degree not possible with other hardware, such as the mashing microgame. Tying the mechanic of key mashing to an actual keyboard over the visual of an internet chat room is the sort of creativity that's great to see in the demo, a sign of more and better to come. Mindwave doesn't only rely on the keyboard, however. The mouse also sees a lot of use as well, usually in more precision-oriented microgames. While the WarioWare series has seen the use of pointer controls using both the Wii sensor bar and Joy-Con gyroscope, both are ineffectual and awkward compared to the level of precision offered by a mouse. All of Mindwave's mouse games are benefited by this extra level of accuracy, and many take advantage of this to have players perform especially exact actions. Microgames such as the stitching one would be particularly imprecise using the Wiimote, for example, but the mouse makes the process painless. And as you might expect, there are microgames that utilize both the mouse and keyboard simultaneously to good effect. This switching between different control schemes, as well as the free-form analog component, makes it play most similarly to Smooth Moves and Move It. Having forms the player is prompted to swap between before a microgame starts has its advantages and drawbacks, but for the purposes of this video, I just want to focus on one specific aspect. Combining multiple control schemes with multiple different peripherals leads to a level of average complexity far above what the Wario series has seen. In the average Wario microgame, the player is required to use only a button or two, many times requiring only a single input or motion. Most microgames boil down to a test of reactions at their core. Probably because that's a simple and natural thing to base fast-paced microgames with basic controls around. While the most minimal Mindwave microgames have a similar level of complexity, plenty have control schemes far more complicated. Some require full use of the arrow keys and other buttons to perform multiple inputs. Some require a series of inputs in unusual places across the keyboard, and some require the player to manipulate a character while looking around with the mouse at the same time. A perfectly normal thing to see in many computer games, but much more elaborate than may be expected. There's some relevant criticism here, being that increased complexity reduces the instant readability of situations. When you just have to press a button to succeed, it's often not hard to be able to tell what you have to do when seeing a puzzle for the first time. No tutorial needed. Some of Mindwave's puzzles require comparatively complex sequences of inputs, as well as presenting generally more broad and complicated game states. As a whole, this tends to make the microgames less arcadey and more like bite-sized gameplay snippets of more involved games. While this could be said to go against the purpose of the microgame in the first place, I'm more concerned with the fairness aspect. While Mindwave's relatively in-depth tutorial sequence offsets this to some degree, as well as the prompts displaying the correct control scheme, it's still less fair on a first go of things than its biggest inspiration. Arguably, a game like this shouldn't worry too much about being initially fair, as subsequent fairness is far more important, but it's still an area where it lags behind Wario. Whether the microgames are reaction or strategy focused, Mindwave introduces other elements on top of them that can add some much needed spice. One of the weaknesses of the endless modes in Wario is that each attempt is too samey for its own good. Once the player has a mastery of each and every microgame, play can drag on for an extended period of time, because the game doesn't have a way of upping the challenge besides speed increases. While speed-ups are a way to make sure play eventually comes to an end, it wears out its welcome because it doesn't really test the player in any way besides stricter reaction and execution windows. This can increase tension during an initial play of a given stage, but after that point it isn't nearly as useful. Ideally, players would be playing as fast and efficiently as they can from the very beginning of Endless, so this doesn't actually weed out players very effectively. What ends up happening in practice is that players play near perfectly up to the point where it becomes physically too much for them to handle, then lose all their lives in quick order, which doesn't do the best to reach the potential that the Wario remix modes could offer. Mindwave addresses this in not just one, but two ways. The first is actually relevant in the story mode as well. After a certain point, pop-ups will begin appearing over the screen occasionally. They can be removed with a simple click, but they introduce a multitasking element. While controlling the game is easy enough once you become acquainted with the different things you'll be asked to perform, doing so while also trying to remove an ad blocking your way can cause old hat microgames to take on a new life. It also presents a choice, because you can avoid multitasking and wait until a more opportune moment to get rid of that intruder, but you're often sacrificing visual clarity to do so. This isn't the most important addition or anything like that, but it does add something to the microgames that could have become stale, as well as giving the player something to do even when transitioning into the next game. Moreover, I'd expect the finished Mindwave to have more of these external distractions added in. There's a lot of room for different effects, all of which could differently emphasize the characters in the story and add something to the experience without directly impacting the microgames themselves. The second way does just that, influencing the properties of individual games in a way other than affecting their speed. During Endless, microgames can be altered by random effects that occur before they start, changing how they have to be approached on an internal level. I think these changes are best experienced firsthand, so in the interest of avoiding spoilers, I'm only going to show the one that appears earliest. Occasionally, the screen is flipped upside down, mirroring your controls and transforming even the easiest microgames into something you have to concentrate on to a high degree. I'm a bit ashamed to admit it, but I hadn't even considered these sorts of effects as a possible way Wario could be iterated upon before this. In retrospect, this seems like an obvious, easily implemented, and absurdly effective way to squeeze yet more replayability and variance out of the microgames. The list of benefits is long. Not only does it keep microgames feeling fresh, it also tests the player on a wider variety of skills. With pop-ups thrown into the mix as well, there's more than ever to master. Part of the enjoyability in the endless modes of Wario is a feeling of improvement, that you've managed to last longer than before. Needless to say, these effects increase that satisfaction. It presents a very realistic chance that the run you're on right now could not only end up meaningfully different than your last, but also better reflect your understanding of the system mechanics. While speed increases do continue to happen as normal, this change ensures that a player getting far isn't solely determined by how they handle stricter time limits. It better tests a player's ingenuity by having them solve unexpected situations. I think, at its core, that's the true value of this edition. Playing a WarioWare game has two stages, discovery and honing. In the discovery portion, players are presented with games they haven't seen before, so they have to quickly respond to new stimuli. Honing occurs later, when the player has an understanding of what's expected of them. This change manages to bring that initial aspect of unpredictability into the honing portion of the gameplay, which is maybe its most important effect. A large part of the Wario series' appeal is how it can come from left field with something new, but that joy doesn't last forever. Eventually, you've seen everything the game has to offer, at which point honing becomes the primary way to enjoy it. There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but I think most of us who have played these games wish we could keep seeing new microgames forever. While Mindwave doesn't generate fresh microgames on the spot, it does the next best thing, which is add additional layers on top of existing ones to the point that they might as well be new. Finding a way to stretch out the initial discovery of the Wario series into the later stages of play deserves a lot of praise. To do so in a way that also increases the honing elements at the same time is downright excellent design. I'd say, overall, all of these gameplay factors discussed make Mindwave more of a game for those invested in the culture of games than Wario. More of a gamer's game, if you will. It frequently feeds off of established control schemes and tropes in its microgames. Its mechanics are easier to understand for those who have played similar games. It generally presents more complex situations, both in terms of the microgames themselves and the modifiers, and it contains a higher ratio of longer, more involved microgames. This isn't to say that Mindwave is a hardcore experience or anything similar, just that someone familiar with the gaming medium is more primed to get the most out of the gameplay on an initial pass than someone not. I have no idea whether this was intentional by the dev team or not, but I'd propose that it was potentially inevitable. Mindwave is clearly a game made by people hyper-immersed in gaming and internet culture. That aspect of it oozes out of every asset and situation presented, to the point that this stylistic choice is one of the game's defining aspects. With that in mind, it should come as no surprise that the microgames assume the player has a similar level of familiarity with these concepts. Take this microgame, for example. If you're not versed in this sort of game, it would probably be pretty confusing what you're supposed to do the moment you take control. There's a lot of visual noise here, enough to cause a newcomer some amount of temporary disorientation. But for those of you in the audience who are well acquainted with games as a medium, you probably jumped to a correct assumption about how it played the moment it appeared on screen. The game is presented like this because the designers are familiar with how games are presented generally, and they assume players can make the same assumptions they do. This may not be true in all cases, but at least the microgames on offer showcase a high level of subsequent fairness anyways, which is more important in the long run. Ultimately, I'd say Mindwave, or at least this demo version of Mindwave, is defined by how it both de-emphasizes gamic elements in the WarioWare formula, while also providing more gaminess in other areas. I think most would agree that WarioWare is an extremely gamey series. It's focused around a sort of arcade-style fun to an extent that many other modern series aren't. It doesn't have any ambition at all, instead providing simple gameplay with no pretension of being anything it isn't. Mindwave, on the other hand, is far more hungry. By sharing a focus between story and gameplay, it presents a grander experience than Wario, but it has to juggle more elements to do so. The focus on a singularly gamic idea is gone, but surprisingly, Mindwave features higher mechanical complexity. Its microgames tend to be more in-depth, and its additions test the player on a wider variety of skills. For this reason, Mindwave can feel like it has two distinct halves, not in the sense that the two areas of design are working against each other, but rather that each part has a clear border. While all of this could be a turn-off for some, it has the effect of distinguishing it from Wario, providing a different overall experience while retaining many of that series' defining characteristics. I'm of the belief that for any iteration on a concept to be truly successful, it has to make itself meaningfully unique. Mindwave does, doing things differently enough from its biggest inspiration such that no one could ever accuse it of being a mere knockoff.